This week, we speak with Phillip Maddux from Signal Sciences about the future of AppSec. In the news segment, an animated GIF goes ... A privacy-preserving process goes poorly. Security responsibility among dev, sec, and ops goes perplexing, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. By connecting to your code repository, Actrix generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, Actrix develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with Actrix at securityweekly.com/Actrix. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk. Discover a simple way to secure your app without the need for a full security team. With trusted software, simply drag and drop your app and get it back fully protected within a couple of minutes. Trusted software is the smartest zero-touch app protection solution on the market. Change the world one app at a time. With 50 years of security expertise, Erdeto's software security technology and cyber services protect over 5 billion devices and applications for some of the world's best-known brands. To request a demo, visit securityweekly.com/Erdeto.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 110, recorded June 8th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Good morning. And Matt goes... I don't know what I go. All your intros goes ... I was trying to think of something clever. I couldn't figure it out.
Matt just goes with the flow, and so does John Kinsella, who we have here as well.
Hey, I'm going with the flow. I shaved just for you guys today, so I hope you appreciate it.
Ooh. A great way to start us off on a Monday. Thank you, John. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, June 22nd to 24th, now a fully virtual event. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code. Join the Security Weekly mailing list and receive your invite to our community Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. We're active in the Discord channel right now. There's some guy, JLK, is in there making noise. Come say hi to him. Phillip Maddux is a trusted AppSec advisor at Signal Sciences. He has over 10 years of experience in information security, with the majority of that time focused on application security in the financial services sector. In his spare moments, he enjoys converting ideas to code and committing them to GitHub. Hello, Phillip, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking some time between all that commit early, commit often, and talk about the future of AppSec. And I kind of wanted to lead into it with saying in the early 2000s, security community was talking about how port 80 and 443 are the two holes that everyone opens in their firewall. Now, perhaps we're mostly just talking about port 443 because HTTPS is pervasive. But the future of AppSec, or even maybe the state of AppSec now, has to be a little bit more than most people are using HTTPS, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely has to be more than just that. Obviously, you're going to have controls throughout the application itself, as you know, end users are targeted, right? So if you move to HTTPS, then the attack focus is going to shift to other areas to find that path in.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of changes as we've talk here on the show about DevOps and AppSec and how those two play together. So there's got to be changes as well, I imagine, in tools, but perhaps not necessarily that new tools exist, or maybe that's part of the case, but also how different teams adopt them or approach the tools. So I'm curious, as you're kind of looking ahead towards where AppSec is moving to, do you see this in terms of where applications are being built in the cloud? Do you see it as an aspect primarily of tooling, or even just people, as it's more we talk about DevOps or DevSecOps rather than the security team as a different group?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of all of that, and I think definitely existing tools are going to be leveraged. I think where and how they're leveraged, that might change over time. So more integration into the pipeline, so to speak, and automation around that, right? So I think it's going to be more automation driven, and more just integrated into the platforms that they're using to deploy applications.
And I think there's probably some new tools coming, because there are some legacy tools that are out there that may not be as easy to integrate into the CI/CD pipeline. We see a lot of new technologies really trying to focus at the developers and the developer tool sets that are providing newer security capabilities. So I think we'll see some new entrants into the space as well, right, Phillip?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And I think that there's a focus on integration with the pipelines, right? So it does become more developer focused. And I think kind of I hear people start talking about GitOps, right? And so we've had all these different ops taglines, and I think what that means is more integration into platforms like GitHub, GitLab, what have you. I think the SaaS tools, the DaaS tools, they start to get commoditized as a part of that. I think IaaS will still be an important player as a part of that as well. And so I think that's the direction we're going into, and it's it's just evolving to that point, and I think we're starting to see that happen, more and more kind of companies focusing on that.
That's interesting, because that aspect of like what GitLab or GitHub are pulling into commoditizing, as you put it, is a lot of like dependency checking, or just, is this an outdated version, which is a problem everybody has, but also likely everybody has the same problem with the same large group of dependencies, whether they're npm or Ruby gems or what have you, something like that. But you also mentioned IaaS, and IaaS, rather than where like dependency checkers are looking at what are the third-party code you're pulling in, IaaS is actually what tests have you already written. So that kind of stood out to me as something that is possibly not going to be as easily commoditized or maybe as easily deployed, because it's also predicated on the idea that you have some tests in the first place, that now you can actually just throw some security aspects on those testing as well. So I guess that's my statement. My comment there, my question is, whether it's the IaaS or SaaS or DaaS tools, who do you see as kind of the driver of wanting those tools, deploying, and even using them? Is it that dev team, or is the security team still really the pushing for those?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because in my world, with Signal Sciences, we actually see a fair bit of dev teams driving some of the security initiatives for their applications, because they understand the threats, and they want to make sure their applications are secure. So they're looking for how they can do that. Now they're looking at how they can secure their applications, but they want to find the tools that are not going to get in their way, right? So they want things that are going to be easily integratable, and like I said, not necessarily going to cause friction in their development process. But of course, we're still going to see security teams driving this as well, right? Because that's kind of their charge, right? Like they're charged with ensuring applications are secure, and what are the things out there that we need to do that. So they'll be driving that. But it is interesting, and I think positive to see that we're starting to see more and more dev teams, take initiative in that regard.
Phillip, I bet there's a difference here, right? In some respects. development's probably worried about the early parts of the pipeline, kind of the build ship components, right? So static analysis, software composition analysis, maybe some instrumentation, even though it might be used more in a runtime mode. But then once the application's in production, this becomes an operational component. And like the runtime products are probably more geared to the security folks because security wants to see what's happening. So DAST and maybe RASP and some of these other runtime products. Do you see that split? Because I could easily see that split.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, right? Like we still, dev teams want to have that security control and they kind of want to set it and forget it, right? Because again, they don't want it in the way, right? And then, I think we still have the problem of, once you kind of deploy the application to production, then it's someone else's problem, right? Like it's a security team's problem. But I think we're definitely like when we move towards the future and kind of when I think about the future of AppSec, roughly 5 years out. And even today, really, we see it today is that in production, monitoring is huge, right? Like that's pretty much going to be what it boils down to for securing your applications in the future. Is you have to have robust monitoring and instrumentation to be able to do that in production. So yeah, I mean, it's just a critical piece, and I think that's actually a good area to focus on initially. To understand how your app's being attacked and so on and so forth. But again, it's who's doing that, right? And kind of, as I think further out in the future and we look at, monitoring capabilities and, ultimately it could be it could be just accountants monitoring the cost of applications, right? So, if there's a spike in an application's CPU utilization, is that inefficient code or is it being attacked, right? So we might have accountant ops monitoring from that perspective.
The application bean counters. There we go. That's what we need.
No, but that's a really good point because it's bringing up that idea of monitoring, and security shouldn't go away just because now that the app is deployed and being monitored. And you called out an interesting budget aspect, especially as there's a shift into a cloud, whether it's inefficient code or an attack that's just hammering an endpoint that has a sort of an asymmetric resource utilization that can spike the CPU or spike bandwidth somehow. That's actually a very quantifiable cost. I'm also curious, and so there's a response to that. What do? Do you fix the code? Do you start to just block that traffic? Do you start to block on IP bases or IP blocks, or do you start to block on the behavior that you see? But there's also been a couple things, and again, trying to look towards the future here, of other people talking about how else might we respond in terms of, I'll use the term deception or honeypots, or just ways of sinkholing even a lot of abusive traffic so that it doesn't necessarily lead into a full account takeover, or it raises the attacker costs when they're trying to figure out, do some carding attacks. Is this group of credit card numbers valid? So switching a little bit to sort of that threat model or the responses now after we've been monitoring, Phillip, what are some of the things you're imagining in a couple of years that we'll start seeing more of in that response angle?
Yeah, I definitely think what you mentioned as it relates to honeypots and deception, that I think that's an area that we need to do more in, and I think we're going to go in that direction. And I would say there's definitely got to be more done even today with the types of anomalies and things you're monitoring for and instrumentation in the application. So there's definitely more to do there. But yeah, when you get to kind of active defense or response, it kind of speaks to the automation component of things. But yeah, having deception kind of baked into the application itself, whether it would take an organization that's mature enough to kind of bake it in at the code layer. That would be nice. That's a very sophisticated way of doing it, but I think we'll need solutions that can actually do that kind of at an outer layer, not necessarily at the code layer. But yeah, so making it more expensive for the attacker and effectively leveraging those techniques with deception in the application, so application layer, deception or honeypots, to cause the attacker to expose themselves, so IR teams can respond to that.
Sort of to That's interesting. I'm going to take a chance here and connect this with one of our previous guests we had recently. So nothing bad on you, however you play this, but what's your thoughts on deception versus obfuscation of that application, either at the source level or at a binary level?
I guess it depends. I mean, the more kind of techniques you can apply, the better, right? So, and I guess it's going to boil down to the type of resources you have to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think to kind of I see where you're going. That's interesting, John. I think one of the angles there too is sort of there's a deception in the sense of responding via, over network and giving back, increasing uncertainty in a response. In other words, did this carding attack, did my brute force actually guess an account with the correct password or guess the CVV for a credit card, versus did we obscure something that just makes it harder to gain 100% confidence in knowledge of like a client-side app? But that's interesting because deception is an underlying theme of those both. And I think also too, Phillip, you mentioned this as if you have a mature team that can instrument the code to do this type of deception, whether it's in a client app or an HTTP API, that's great. But if you aren't that mature, you'll need some tooling. You need some third party to help with that. So I guess one of my questions is, at the beginning we sort of use an arbitrary 5 years ahead. We're taking the Star Trek model of the future. In 5 years, if we're starting from scratch, is that enough time for an org to mature into that area, or would they be going into different ways of improving the monitoring instead, or improving the tooling? I guess maybe what does it look like for an org to mature over this time to then figure out that maybe it's the build or buy type of discussion it leads into?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. 5 years out, and that's kind of an arbitrary, just kind of good number to use for this conversation. But I think definitely the monitoring and kind of instrumenting for anomalies, I think will definitely make really good progress. Certainly within 5 years. Now, getting into actually implementing deception, I mean, I'm definitely seeing organizations looking at it now, and they're talking about it. I haven't seen kind of at the app layer like a mature implementation of it, but they're definitely talking about it now, and that's a good sign. I think we'll see that progress, and we'll likely see. Obviously, tools are going to come out around that. In fact, it's kind of as a hobby thing. That's something I work on as well with a project I run. But yeah, I think 5 years is a pretty good target number. And I guess this is an area that I definitely have interest in. So I'm probably more optimistic. But I think we can get there where we at least see some very basic techniques implemented into the application layer for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see technology today on the instrumentation monitoring side, right? We already have this technology out there. You can do it through some of the APM. You've got, what Sysdig's been doing on the performance, and now on a security. So the instrumentation piece is already there. Deception, though, I still see it behind, right? It started at the network. Now it's starting to shift to the endpoint. I think there's a leap still to move deception from network endpoint to application, because you've got to come up with the right way to do it. You can't use the network or endpoint techniques, I don't think, effectively at the app layer.
Yeah.
It's
thought of it. Okay.
Sorry, at least to me, I think of it as it's a very sophisticated play. So I think that the question there on that 5-year timeline is how do you make that simple for it to be more easily implemented? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you start with very simple techniques, right? And then you eventually kind of mature it as you go along over time. So just very simple techniques of, littering the application with various tokens, whether it's, honey URLs or paths, putting paths in the section of your robots.txt for denies, right? And so anybody kind of probing those endpoints are going to that's good information to have, right? Perhaps you want to start blocking based on that, or you want to do further investigation around that IP address. embedding tokens and lures like in comments in the pages and things like that, hidden fields with kind of token values, query strings with token values and things like that. One scenario that I really like is actually deploying kind of mimic your application instrumented with deception in like non-production environments, because I think we see that non-production environments are going to be targeted, more targeted than production, because that's typically going to be your path of least resistance. I think we see that a lot in kind of bug bounties and things like that. So you would create put out a deceptive instance of the application, or effectively a honeypot of the application, and then you add a DNS entry, which is like devbox1.myapp.com, right? And so any probes to that, using DNS, right? Obviously, someone's looking at your DNS and they're looking for, targets within your environment, right? So that should stand out. It's like, okay, we know there should be no legitimate developers accessing this, or obviously users accessing this. So why is this being accessed, and who is this, and what's going on? And that's something that can be implemented very easily today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good network technique, right? To look for the DNS and the traffic to the DNS. I think the more sophisticated use cases require you to embed stuff in the application at a way that doesn't tip your hand, but also allows you to collect that data. And I don't know that traditional deception techniques work at that layer yet, and that's why I think it will.
No, they don't. There's definitely more work to be done there, and I would say, like, I mean, even with customers at Signal Sciences, they have some custom instrumentation leveraging our solution to look for various honey tokens or paths and things like that. So they are actually doing that sort of thing. So that's the starting point there.
Yeah, and then integrating those basic canary token type examples back into your firewall, your web app firewall, creates that kind of closed loop to say, all right, somebody's testing this part of the app. We know that maybe that's coming from a malicious location. Maybe blacklist that. It does provide a way to protect the overall app more holistically in the meantime, because they're tripping some of those those easy triggers, right?
Yeah. And I do want to go back to the point that was made about, I guess, related to obfuscation of the responses you provide to the attacker when it hits an application. And that's actually a very extremely important point. And we're also doing that at Signal Sciences as well. And it's the information or that feedback to the attacker, right? Like, was my attack successful or not? Am I wasting my time or not? Or did I find something or did I not? If that attack is always responded to with, let's say a 200, but it didn't actually execute in the application itself, it's effectively blocked. That goes a long way to kind of wasting your attacker's time.
Yeah, I think that's the two aspects that Matt touched on too, that you also talked about there, is that it's one thing just to generate a lot more events. Because you can already have, here's our network firewall saying we're being port scanned. But it's sort of like, do I really care, or why should I care that I'm generating more events and more information about just people are attacking my website? Because you spin up a website, it's going to be scanned, it's going to be targeted almost immediately. But in this case, what I liked was that idea of spin it up, but you have that feedback loop that's relatively automated within your firewall, or your web app firewall, that can just start to block the traffic, or slow the rate limit the traffic, or deny it, or even that obfuscation aspect can then start to blind the attacker, so to speak, so that they're not getting any useful signal about what their probes are returning. So their probes are now useless. So that is, I think, the important nuance of actually deploying honeypots, honey tokens, what have you, so that they're effective and useful rather than just generating log entries.
Yeah, exactly. You touched on something interesting, because one approach, if you take that sort of DNS based example to an application, you take that and then you couple it with taking in a threat feed. Like, for example, with my project HoneyDB, I run honeypots throughout the world, and so all that, you could take that data, and a lot of that effectively is somewhat noise, right? It's just a lot of it's automated scanning and things like that, right? So you could effectively take input from a feed like that, and then weed out the noise versus, this IP is attacking this, this honeypot in our environment, but this IP is not scanning the entire internet. Oh, so maybe that's more interesting to me because maybe it's more targeted.
No, yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the other things, and I want to shift to, or maybe broaden the conversation a little bit about maybe what different attacks are also going to look like, or if attacks will be any different in, our 5-year mission here. Because I'm going to predict that, yes, cross-site scripting will always be around. But are there new attacks or new threats that you think will have an elevated risk, or being more optimistic, are there certain threats that you think will diminish and be perhaps just replaced by something else?
Yeah, so I think as we're evolving into the future, we're kind of closing down that surface area for attacks. So there's a couple of areas I think where attackers are going to have to change kind of their tactics or what they're targeting. So for example, you think of account takeovers, right? If we look at tools that are coming out or solutions that are coming out with like FIDO and device authentication, that could potentially eliminate that type of a problem. So attackers are going to have to start kind of targeting the user's like endpoint, or to be able to hijack a session, or compromise their endpoint to be able to impersonate them to get access to the application. So I think it'll be a shift, unfortunately, maybe towards the users. They'll be more targeted, but we'll also see, I think, targeting the platforms that these applications are delivered on. So your Kubernetes and your Envoys and mesh networks and things like that. So those will be more targeted. And I think if the world goes to just port 443 everywhere, there's what we're seeing in multiple versions of protocols, right? So HTTP, HTTP2, WebSockets, HTTP3, which is UDP based, which kind of gets interesting, and gRPC and things like that. So we kind of have these plethora of protocols that are not going to be perfect and may have vulnerabilities in themselves. And so those will definitely probably be a focus of attackers as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the protocols too, because especially with HTTP3, obviously, as you pointed out, could be protocol problems itself, just in the implementation of it. But also too, they tend to be, tooling has to keep up. And they can be, potentially getting to the point where it's a little bit harder to do efficient manual testing anyway. So I think with TLS 1.3, that makes intercepting proxies and intermediate proxies a lot more difficult due to the way it implements its forward secrecy. In HTTP3, the UDP aspect is great, but also the multiple streams make things really interesting. So I'm going to put my prognostication hat on and just say I'll be very curious to see how tooling keeps up, how manual tooling keeps up to be able to do manual analysis of those protocols, or how much is going to really the advantage moves to the DevOps teams doing IAST or RASP, and just being a bit more agnostic of the protocol itself and putting their security into the testing of the application workflows, the application logic.
Yeah.
Phillip, one quick question on APIs, right? Is we see certain attacks at the application directly go down. You said those are going to shift probably to the user, and I agree with you. Identity and application and the interaction of those two are going to be critical. Do you see attacks moving to the APIs with the proliferation of APIs and some of the maybe lack of protections at the API layer? Do you see that attack surface expanding, at least in the near term?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're already an API world. I was going to say we're going to become an API world, but we really already are. So there's going to be a focus there, because APIs might be new to a lot of teams, but I think there's going to be some time from maturity there. But it's different, from kind of thinking about your user base and creating a UI and securing it from that perspective versus opening an API to the world, right? It'll be directly attacked. It'll be abused, right? So even just from a functionality standpoint, it's going to be abused. So that's going to continue, right? Because that's what's proliferating is APIs. So that's going to continue to be a target, and will expand. But at the same time, I also think we're going to get better at securing them. And I think if we do it right, we'll probably do a better job at securing the APIs than typical traditional applications.
I love the optimism.
I'm very optimistic. I mean, I think we could be in a good place in 5 years. So,
final question, if I can stick one in there. So this popped up in my head, about halfway through the conversation. So I want to try and squeeze it in. As we talk about sort of playing with some of these protocols and throwing a curveball, so to speak, back towards the attacker, at what point are you concerned about breaking an API? And the example which came to my head as you were talking was, you mentioned, always throwing HTTP 200s. I believe for some of the JSON frameworks, that's actually a quote unquote illegal to throw a 200 when there's actually an error, and it can help actually make it more difficult to troubleshoot. So at what point when do you play nice and when do you not?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's a good question, right? And I think it may depend on the context of the application itself, and also kind of the threat you're trying to mitigate. But I think there's no necessarily easy answer, but it's just it could be a trade-off. But I would lean towards sticking with spec and not breaking the API, or kind of going against the spec of how APIs should behave. But on that specific example, with blocking or responding in a 200 code, maybe you're not responding in a 200 code, maybe you're responding with something else. I've even had a discussion with someone, with a colleague, about a customer that wanted to respond with random response codes each time, and I'm not sold on that. I kind of think that's a tell as well to the attacker. But I think whatever you end up responding with, you kind of be consistent. And just kind of thinking about the whole deception story, right? So if you kind of pick up on an attack, like, hey, this is definitely an attack, if you can then route that traffic to a deception layer, it can respond with the 200s, and you don't have to worry about it. So that's another aspect I think that's interesting, is to be able to route someone off to a sandbox or a honeypot or what have you.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, Phillip, you had mentioned HoneyDB, and I think the project is hosted at honeydb.io. Anything else you want to tell us about that, or can anybody come in and join? What's a little bit of the background there?
Yeah, so it's a project I've been working on, I guess, all the way from its genesis. I was looking, it's probably almost 7 years when this all started. Basically, I've always been a hobbyist with honeypots, and at one point I wanted to kind of free honeypot that worked the way I wanted it to. And I also wanted to learn Python better. So I put the two problems together, and I ended up writing my own honeypot in Python. And it's kind of evolved from there. So basically now it's a community-based project where anybody can sign up. And there's a honeypot agent you can download and configure and deploy wherever you like. And basically the idea is, if you choose to, you can report all your honeypot logs, event logs, back into the main site, where you see that's aggregated. Obviously, if you go to the site, you'll see graphs. And so that's all aggregated together. So people can leverage that information if they want to, as a part of their, threat intel program. And so there's an API on the site as well. So you can sign up, deploy an agent, and start downloading data via the API. It's been a labor of love and has evolved quite a bit in the last more so in the last 3 years or so. But something I continue to enjoy working on. So I definitely appreciate anybody that's interested. Check it out. And there's a Slack community around it as well. So trying to build all that up, and so it's a fun project.
Yeah, I can definitely see why in all those spare moments you're writing and committing code. So that's good to see. Well, Philip, thanks for joining us. We'll definitely try not to wait, a full 5 years to see how this progress is
Yeah.
going on the future of AppSec. So we'll hope to have you back and talk a little bit more about anything from the deception to protecting APIs to also a little bit more in detail on different types of tools that the teams are taking or picking up. So thank you for joining us.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool, and thanks everyone for listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.